I've always liked hiking alone. Some people think it's strange or even reckless, but to me, being out there without anyone else makes the forest feel sharper, more real. There's no chatter to cover the sounds, no safety net to fall back on. It's just me, the trail, and whatever the woods want me to notice. Most of the time, it's peaceful. Most of the time, it's exactly what I want. But I'll never forget the trip where I finally understood the old saying, nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. And even if they do, you still don't want to meet them. It started like any other weekend trip. I'd taken a Friday off work so I could have a long stretch of time to myself. I drove out in the morning, heading toward a state forest a few hours from where I lived. The road grew emptier the further I went, turning from smooth asphalt to cracked two-lane, then finally into gravel that crunched under my tires. By the time I reached the trailhead, there wasn't another car in sight. That was the first thing that put me at ease. An empty parking lot meant no crowds. No one setting up noisy camps near mine. No groups of college kids drinking by the fire until midnight. Just me. I pulled my pack out of the trunk, locked the car, and shouldered the weight. The straps bit into my shoulders in that familiar way. Not painful, just solid. Like a reminder that once I stepped into those trees, I was carrying everything I needed. The trail started broad and easy, winding between tall pines with needles soft underfoot. The morning air was cool enough that I could see faint puffs of breath if I exhaled hard. The forest was alive with sound then. Birds calling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, the wind brushing the treetops. That's the thing about the woods in daylight. You can almost trick yourself into thinking it's friendly. As the hours passed, the trail narrowed and began to climb. My boots dug into loose soil, my calves burned, and sweat ran down my spine. I paused now and then to drink water and look around. At those stops, the silence felt heavier. The bird calls would fall away, the scurrying stop, and all I'd hear was my own breathing. Then, after a few minutes, the forest would pick back up like nothing had changed. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that dropped into a valley. From up there, I could see the endless sweep of trees, dark and rolling under the sun. Somewhere down there was the lake I wanted to camp by. It was supposed to be quiet, hidden, the kind of place where you could sit by the water and feel like you were the only person left in the world. I started down, taking my time as the trail grew steeper. The descent took longer than I thought, and by the time I reached the valley floor, shadows were already stretching long. I followed a narrow path until I saw water glinting through the trees. The lake appeared suddenly, calm and silver under the fading light. The shoreline was lined with tall grass and reeds, and the air smelled damp and clean. I found a small clearing about 20 yards from the shore. The ground was flat, covered with soft pine needles, and the trees around it were thick enough to give cover from wind. Felt right. I set my pack down and began my usual routine. Tent first, ground sheet laid out, poles fed through, fabric pulled tight. Sleeping bags spread inside, gear stacked neatly. After that, I pulled out my stove and boiled water for one of those freeze-dried meals. While I waited for the water to boil, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. It was something I always did, half out of habit, half out of instinct. I liked knowing what was around me, where the tree line pressed in, how the ground sloped, where the animal trails cut through. I noticed faint tracks near the water, probably deer. I saw a few broken branches low to the ground, nothing unusual. But as I paced, I couldn't shake the thought that someone could stand just a few feet into the trees and I'd never see them. The underbrush was thick, shadows already pooling in the fading light. The water boiled, and I returned to eat. The food was bland, but warm, and as I sat cross-legged by the tent, the forest grew darker. The lake turned from silver to black glass, reflecting only the thin line of moon starting to rise. I cleaned up, packed my stove away, and sat still for a long time listening. That was when the thought came, sharp and heavy. Nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. Even if they do, you don't want to meet them. I didn't know why it came just then. Maybe it was the silence, the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Maybe it was the way the trees looked, black against darker black, impossible to see into. I shook it off and crawled into my tent. Inside, the air was cooler, I zipped the door shut, slid into my sleeping bag, and tried to settle. At first, I listened to the night sounds. A frog croaked near the water. Something plopped into the lake. The wind sighed through the trees. Normal sounds, comforting in their way. My body loosened, but my mind stayed sharp, waiting. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe more, I woke up suddenly. My eyes snapped open to darkness. The tent was silent. The forest outside was silent. Too silent. No frogs, no wind. Not even the faint hum of insects. I held my breath and listened. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A sound. Soft. Deliberate. A footstep. Not the scatter of an animal. Not the rush of something wild. This was weight placed carefully on the ground. One step, then a pause. Another step. Closer. Every muscle in my body went tight. My chest ached from holding my breath, but I didn't dare let it out. Whoever was out there wasn't wandering. They weren't lost. They were moving slow, careful, like they didn't want to be heard. The steps circled, not directly toward the tent, but around it like someone was testing the space, checking. At one point, the sound stopped. Total silence pressed in, so heavy I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then a faint crack of a twig. Still there. I thought about unzipping the tent, but what would I do? Step out and confront them? My knife was small, useless against someone with real intent. My bear spray was buried in my pack, out of reach. I stayed still, every nerve screaming. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the sounds began to fade. The careful steps retreated, swallowed by the forest. I didn't sleep again. I lay frozen, waiting for the sounds to return, until pale light finally seeped through the nylon. When morning came, the clearing looked the same. My gear was untouched. The ground held no obvious tracks, but I knew what I had heard. I packed quickly, shoving gear into my pack with shaking hands. My plan for another night was gone. I wanted out. The hike back was a blur. Every crack of a branch made me whip my head around. Every patch of brush felt like it was hiding someone just out of sight. Once, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between trees, but when I stopped, there was nothing. By the time I reached the trailhead, my nerves were raw. The lot was still empty. My car sat alone, coated in dust. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands trembled on the wheel as I pulled away. The drive back was long, but my mind replayed the night over and over. The careful steps, the circling, the silence. Nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. And even if they do, you still don't want to meet them. I had been lucky. Whoever it was had left. They hadn't unzipped the tent, hadn't come closer. But that was enough. Told me someone was out there, moving slow, deliberate, watching. I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore. Because once you hear those footsteps in the dark, once you know for sure that someone has come to your camp in the night, you can't unhear it. You can't ever forget it. The forest hasn't felt the same since. I had been hiking solo for years, and I knew all the arguments against it. People said it was dangerous, that it was reckless to be alone out there. They weren't wrong. Accidents happened. Falls, twisted ankles, bad weather, wrong turns, dehydration. Anything could go wrong, and when you were alone, there was no one to help. But that was exactly what I liked about it. The silence, the feeling that the forest belonged to me, even if just for a night or two. I had a long weekend ahead, and I wanted to spend it out in the backcountry. I picked a trail I had been on once before but never finished. One that wound along a ridge before dipping into a wide stretch of forest and eventually leading to a small lake. My plan was simple. Hike out most of the day, set up camp near the lake, spend one night out there, then hike back the following morning. A short, clean trip. The drive out was quiet. As the miles ticked by and the last of the small towns faded, the road turned to dirt and gravel. By the time I reached the trailhead, I hadn't seen another vehicle for over half an hour. There were no cars in the lot when I pulled in. That was a good sign. Fewer people meant more solitude. I shouldered my pack, checked the straps, and set off. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking through mixed forest. The trees were thick, mostly pine and spruce, with patches of birch breaking up the darker greens. The air was cool, the kind of air you only get under tall trees where the sunlight struggles to touch the ground. Birds flitted between branches. Squirrels chattered at me and vanished. Hours passed in steady rhythm. Boots on dirt, the pull of my pack straps, sweat prickling across my back. The trail narrowed as I gained elevation, and the sounds of the world dropped away until it was just me and the forest. By the time I reached the lake, the light was shifting. The sun hung low, casting a pale reflection across the still water. I found a small clearing tucked a short distance from the shore, hidden enough that no one would see me from the trail. The ground was flat, soft with pine needles, and surrounded by tall trees that broke the wind. I dropped my pack and got to work. Tent first, always. Ground sheet, poles, fly. Within minutes, my shelter was up. Sleeping bags spread inside, pack leaning against the wall. Then came food. I pulled out my small stove and boiled water, watching steam curl upward as the forest darkened around me. Dinner was one of those freeze-dried meals, bland but filling. After I ate, I wandered the edges of the clearing, stretching my legs. The forest was already growing dim, colors draining into shadow. I stopped at the water's edge, listening. It was so still, so empty, that I could hear my own breath. That was when the thought hit me. Nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. Even if someone does, you still don't want to meet them. I'd heard it said before in different ways by people who spent time in the backcountry. It was something you learned over the years. If someone shows up at your tent at night, it's not a coincidence. People don't stumble into campsites in the dark. If they come, it's deliberate, and nobody comes out there with good intentions. I shook it off, but it stayed lodged in my head. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was black. The only light came from a thin slice of moon through the treetops. I zipped the door shut, slid into my sleeping bag, and tried to settle. The night air was crisp, and the nylon walls of the tent crinkled faintly as I shifted. First, it was fine. I listened to the small sounds. Wind brushing through branches, a frog croaking somewhere near the water, the occasional plop of something dropping into the lake. My body began to relax, but my mind stayed sharp. Every faint noise made my ears twitch. Every snap of a twig made me hold my breath. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, and the forest outside was silent. No frogs, no wind, nothing. That silence was wrong. I held still, every nerve awake, straining to hear. Then it came, a sound, slow, careful, footsteps, not an animal bounding or crashing, not the shuffle of a deer. This was weight placed deliberately on the ground, one step, then a long pause, then another. My chest tightened. My first instinct was to breathe fast, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be noisy. They were trying to be quiet. The steps came closer. Crunch, pause, crunch. They weren't rushing, weren't wandering. They were deliberate, circling. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, ears locked on the faint sounds. The steps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it again. The sound of something brushing against branches. A shift of weight. Someone was just outside the tree line. I thought about unzipping the tent, but what would I do? Step out and confront whoever it was? I had no weapon beyond a small camp knife. My bear spray was buried in my pack, not in my hand where it should have been. Minutes dragged by. My muscles burned from holding still. Finally, the sound faded. The footsteps retreated, slow at first, then gone completely. I lay awake until dawn, never closing my eyes again. When light finally seeped into the forest, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Everything looked normal. My gear was untouched. No tracks jumped out at me, but I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, stuffing gear into my pack with clumsy hands. My plan to stay a second night evaporated. I wanted out. I wanted distance between me and that lake. The hike back felt twice as long. Every bend in the trail made me glance over my shoulder. Every thick patch of brush made me imagine someone standing just beyond sight. Once, I swore I saw movement, just a flicker of shadow shifting, but when I froze and stared, there was nothing. When I reached the trailhead, the lot was still empty. My car sat alone, dust settling on the windshield. I tossed my pack inside, slammed the door, and locked it before starting the engine. My hands shook on the wheel as I pulled away. The entire drive back, the thought ran through my head, over and over. Nobody good ever visits your camp in the middle of the night. Even if they do, you still don't want to meet them. I had been lucky. Whoever was out there had circled, watched, then left. That was it. But the fact they had come at all meant something. They hadn't stumbled on me by accident. They hadn't come for company. They came for a reason. And that reason was something I never wanted to learn the hard way. I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore. I can't, because now I know too well what it feels like, lying in the dark, hearing those slow, deliberate steps outside your tent, waiting for a stranger you'll never see. I had been planning the hike for weeks, maybe even months if I really thought about it. It wasn't anything extreme or some record-breaking backcountry adventure. It was just a solo overnight hike along a trail that cut through a section of forest a few hours from where I lived. I wanted the quiet, the peace, the solitude. I had spent so much time stuck in my routines. Work, errands, screens always glowing in front of me, that I craved something simple. Just me, my pack, the trail, and a place to camp for the night. The drive out was long but uneventful. The further I got from town, the more the landscape shifted into long stretches of tree line, winding dirt roads, and the occasional farmhouse far back from the road. By the time I reached the trailhead parking lot, there were only 3 other cars. That told me 2 things right away. 1, the trail wasn't completely deserted, but 2, it was quiet enough that I wouldn't be passing groups of people all the time. Exactly what I wanted. I locked the car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was easy at first, a wide dirt path that narrowed as it cut deeper into the woods. The sounds of the world I knew, engines, voices, even faint traffic, faded until all I could hear was wind brushing through leaves and the crunch of my boots on dry soil. I had started later in the day than I planned, so by the time I'd been walking for a few hours, the light was already starting to shift. The sun wasn't gone yet, but the forest floor was dim, with long shadows stretching between the trees. I figured I had maybe an hour and a half at most, before I needed to stop and set up camp. I found a spot that looked right. A small clearing off to the side of the trail with a patch of relatively flat ground. It was far enough in that I wouldn't have to worry about casual hikers stumbling into me, but open enough that I'd have room to lay out my gear. I set my pack down, stretched my shoulders, and pulled out my small tent. I had the motions down by heart. Lay out the ground sheet, stake the corners, feed the poles through, snap them into place. It always felt satisfying, like setting up a little temporary home out in the middle of nowhere. I tossed my sleeping bag inside, then dug around for my small camp stove to boil water for some freeze-dried food I had packed. As the water heated, I wandered a little bit around the clearing. Nothing major, just pacing the perimeter, checking out the trees, the undergrowth, the natural lay of the land. I liked to see what was around me, get a sense of the environment. I noticed faint game trails, deer or smaller animals moving through at some point. I saw where branches had broken, where pine needles layered thick on the ground, where a bird had left white droppings streaking down the bark of a trunk. All the little signs that told me I wasn't the first thing to move through here. I poked around more, not really looking for anything but just wanting to take it in. That's when it crossed my mind. The thought, the one that drops in without asking. While I was poking around the camp, somebody could have been watching me. Not just some deer or raccoon, not just something that lived there naturally. I mean, another person. It was a thought I shook off, but not completely. I didn't know why it felt heavy. I had passed no one on the trail, heard no voices, and seen no signs of people since I parked. But as I stood in that little clearing, it hit me how quiet it was. How easy it would be for someone to be standing just inside the tree line, watching. I couldn't see 10 feet deep into the woods in some spots. The undergrowth was so thick. I told myself not to overthink it. I went back, ate my meal, packed everything away neat so there weren't food smells drifting around. As dusk turned into dark, I settled into the tent. The silence grew heavier at night. During the day, there were birds, insects, the sound of wind brushing through branches. But at night, when those things slowed down, every sound became more noticeable. A twig snapping carried weight. A branch creaking overhead felt like something deliberate. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent as the air cooled. I drifted in and out of light sleep, never falling all the way under, my brain still listening, still processing every sound. At some point in the night, I woke up fully. I didn't know what time it was. My watch was buried in my pack, and I didn't want to dig around in the dark. But I was awake, alert. Something had stirred me. I lay there in total silence for what felt like minutes, ears straining. That's when I heard it. Not close, not far. Just a faint sound of something moving. A step, maybe two. Then silence. Not an animal shuffling quickly. Not leaves rustling in the wind. Something that sounded more measured, like weight being placed carefully on the ground. I held my breath and waited. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe. A deer would move carefully, wouldn't crash around. Could have been that. But the thought was back, stronger now. Somebody watching. Somebody standing just outside the clearing. Maybe 10, maybe 20 feet back, keeping still after realizing I'd stirred. I forced myself to breathe slow and quiet until eventually sleep tugged me under again. When morning came, the clearing looked the same. Nothing was out of place. My food was untouched. The ground was undisturbed. I made coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and packed my things. As I rolled up my tent, I glanced around at the tree line. The feeling from the night still lingered, like something had brushed up against me but left no mark. I started hiking again. The trail cut deeper into the woods, with occasional ridges that gave me views out across long valleys. It was beautiful, everything I wanted the trip to be, but I couldn't shake that thought. Every time I stopped to take a drink or readjust my pack, I looked over my shoulder. Every patch of brush seemed thicker. Every shadow seemed to hide depth I couldn't see into. A few hours in, I came across another clearing. This one wasn't natural. Someone had been there. The remains of a fire pit sat in the middle, blackened rocks in a loose circle. There were branches stacked in a way that didn't look random, and a patch of flattened grass where someone had clearly laid a tent or tarp. It wasn't recent, not freshly abandoned, but it wasn't old either. A week maybe or less. I crouched near the fire pit, brushing ash between my fingers. Cold, gray, no scent of smoke. Still, it was enough to bring that feeling back full force. Someone else had been out here. Maybe they still were. I pushed on, telling myself it was normal. People camp in the woods. That's what I was doing too. It didn't mean anything, but my senses wouldn't shut off. Every time I moved around a bend in the trail, I scanned ahead. Every time the forest grew quiet, I waited for that faint sound again. The careful placement of weight just beyond sight. When I finally stopped for the day, I didn't wander the clearing the way I had before. I kept close to my pack, kept my tent near the trail instead of pushing deeper. My back itched whenever I turned it to the woods, like eyes were pressing into me. That night was worse. I woke again, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something. I held still, listening. Nothing moved, nothing spoke, just silence so deep it felt like it had weight. And then a crunch, very faint, slow, careful, the sound of someone testing the ground as they stepped closer. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I waited, every muscle rigid. The sound stopped. Minutes crawled by, or maybe it was an hour. I never heard it again. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back down, but my sleep was thin and broken. When dawn came, I packed quickly, too quickly, shoving things in my pack with little care. I wanted out. The forest felt different now, heavier, like I wasn't walking through it alone anymore. The hike back felt longer, like the trail stretched itself. Every few minutes, I checked behind me. Once, I swore I saw movement, a flicker between trees. But when I stopped and stared, there was nothing. Just shadows, just brush. When I reached the trailhead and saw my car, my relief was so sharp it was almost painful. I dropped my pack in the trunk, slammed it shut, and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors before I even started the engine. The drive back was quiet, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. But even now, even safe at home, I know what I felt out there. While I was poking around my camp, wandering the edges of those clearings, somebody was probably standing just inside the tree line, watching me, silent, patient, close enough to see everything. I'll never know who it was, or if they meant anything by it. But I know what it felt like, and I know I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I was younger when this happened, the kind of age where curiosity usually got the better of me and caution came in second place. My buddies had told me about an abandoned mansion not far from the Meadowdale Beach area, tucked back enough that you wouldn't see it unless you knew where to look. They said it had been empty for years, maybe decades, and that it was the kind of place kids would dare each other to go check out. The story they told wasn't about ghosts or anything like that. It was about the neighbors. Supposedly, the people who lived nearby hated anyone snooping around the mansion. They'd call the cops at the first sight of someone unfamiliar walking up. That should have been enough to make me steer clear. The last thing I wanted was to end up explaining myself to police officers, trying to make "I was curious" sound like a good excuse. But the more I heard about it, the more the idea stuck in my head. I kept picturing this big old house, boarded up windows, peeling paint, a place that felt like it had been forgotten by everyone except for the people determined to keep it that way. Curiosity works like that sometimes. It digs in until it's the only thing you can think about. So, being the not-so-genius I was at the time, I came up with what I thought was a clever solution. Instead of walking up from the front, where the neighbors could see me, I'd go in from the back way. There were trails in the area, and on my phone I could see where the mansion was in relation to them. If I left the trail and cut through the woods, I figured I could get close without anyone noticing. No police, no neighbors, just me and the house. The plan sounded simple enough. I pulled up the address of the mansion on my phone, set it in the GPS, and headed out one afternoon. It wasn't a serious hike. Meadowdale Beach Trail is more of a casual path than anything dangerous. It winds down through the woods toward the water, pretty popular with families and dog walkers. But the idea was to leave it behind at some point, head into the trees, and move toward the mapped location. I started down the trail with my backpack slung over one shoulder, the phone in my hand. The afternoon sun filtered down through the leaves, painting shifting patches of light on the ground. People passed now and then, parents with strollers, joggers, a few other hikers, but I barely noticed them. My eyes kept flicking to the little blue dot on my phone screen, watching it move closer to the point I'd marked. When I thought I was close enough, I stepped off the trail. The dirt under my boots gave way to soft layers of pine needles and tangled roots. Branches snagged at my jacket. The sound of people faded quickly, replaced by the heavier quiet of the woods. I felt a small thrill in my chest. This was the part that made it feel like I was doing something hidden, something I wasn't supposed to be doing. First, it was awkward. My GPS showed a straight line toward the mansion, but the land didn't work that way. I had to weave around thick brush, climb over fallen logs, and step carefully down slopes slick with moss. Every so often, I'd stop, check the screen, turn myself a little, and push forward again. It wasn't far, at least not as the crow flies, but when you're stumbling through unmarked woods, every 100 yards feels longer. Half an hour or so into my little detour, something unexpected happened. The trees opened up ahead of me, and I stepped out onto pavement. It stopped me in my tracks. A paved back road right there in the middle of the woods. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen any turnoffs on the map, no markings for roads. But here it was, faded asphalt cracked with weeds, running across my path. I stood there for a long moment trying to decide what to do. To my left, the road curved away and vanished into the trees. To my right, the ground rose steeply, forming a hill. That was when I thought I heard something. A faint hum, like a car engine in the distance. My stomach dropped. The idea of being caught out there, on some strange road I wasn't supposed to know about, sent a rush of panic through me. Without thinking twice, I darted toward the hill and started climbing. It wasn't easy. The dirt was loose, the incline sharp. My hands clawed at roots, my boots slipped, and I had to scramble like an animal to keep from sliding back down. By the time I reached the top, my legs burned and my palms were streaked with dirt. I crouched low, breathing hard, and peered down toward the road. Silence. No car. No sound at all. My ears rang with the effort of listening. The hum I'd heard wasn't there anymore, and maybe it had never been real to begin with. Maybe it was just the wind or blood rushing in my head. But as I crouched there, catching my breath, I realized I wasn't alone. Up ahead, tucked in a shallow clearing behind the hill, was a cluster of tents. Not one or two, a dozen, maybe more. All different shapes and colors, some old and faded, some newer. They were scattered close together, forming a kind of rough camp. Tarps were strung between trees. I saw coolers, folding chairs, plastic bags, a line of clothes strung up to dry. It was the middle of the afternoon, bright daylight filtering down through the leaves, but the sight froze me in place. This wasn't some family camping trip. This wasn't an organized group outing. This was something else entirely. People living out here, tucked away, far from the main trail, down a road that didn't officially exist. I stayed low, heart pounding. My first thought was to turn and run, but the slope behind me was steep and noisy. If anyone was around, they'd hear me crashing through. So I stayed still, barely breathing, eyes locked on the camp. I didn't see anyone moving, but that almost made it worse. The tents were zipped shut, the camp looked lived in, and the silence pressed down heavy. Whoever was there, they weren't far. I imagined faces turning toward me, people stepping out to see what I was doing there. And I knew instantly that whatever the reason was for all those tents, it wasn't something I wanted to get mixed up in. After what felt like forever, I started backing away. Slow, careful. Every step I placed with full attention, easing my boots onto the ground, making sure not to snap a twig. My body felt coiled, like the smallest mistake would send everything unraveling. I slipped back down the other side of the hill, half sliding, half crawling. When I reached the bottom, I didn't stop. I moved as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run, angling myself back toward where I thought the trail would be. My GPS shook in my hand as I tried to read it, the little blue dot trembling from my unsteady grip. Branches whipped against my arms, roots caught at my boots, but I kept going. My ears strained for sound. Footsteps behind me, voices, anything. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet. My panic made the silence feel louder than noise would have. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled back onto the main trail. The packed dirt path stretched ahead of me, calm and ordinary, like none of what I'd just seen was real. A jogger passed me a few minutes later, earbuds in, completely unaware of the camp that sat just a short distance away through the trees. The contrast made my skin crawl. I didn't stop until I was back at the trailhead, back at my car. My shirt clung with sweat, my hands were scraped raw, and my heart still hadn't slowed down. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before I could bring myself to start the engine. I did end up finding the mansion eventually, but not that day. Not after what I'd seen. I took a different route on a later trip, one that didn't involve cutting through the woods near that hidden camp. Because I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was going on back there, it wasn't meant to be seen. And if I had been noticed, if someone had stepped out of one of those tents and caught me standing there, it wouldn't have been good. Nobody sets up a dozen tents in the middle of the woods, far from a public trail with tarps and lines of clothes, unless they've got a reason to stay hidden. And nobody who goes snooping into something like that comes away better for meeting the people behind it. I walked away lucky. I slipped out before anyone saw me, but I still remember that feeling. The moment when the woods stopped being just trees and shadows and turned into something else, something full of eyes I couldn't see. That's the part that stays with me. That's the part that still makes my skin crawl when I think back on it. I've been hiking most of my life, and I've always liked going off the beaten path. There's something about leaving the safety of a map trail that makes me feel like I'm stepping into another world. One where the rules are a little different, where I have to rely on myself. But there's a difference between enjoying that sense of isolation and actually being vulnerable in it. I learned that the hard way one afternoon, on a hike that should have been simple but turned into the most unsettling experience I've ever had. Started on a weekend where I didn't have much to do. I grabbed my pack, water, and some snacks, and decided I'd head out for a solo day hike. The trail I picked wasn't remote by any means, and it wasn't dangerous. It was the kind of trail families went on for picnics or short walks, but I wasn't in the mood for crowds. I had this habit of branching off whenever I saw a faint side path or animal track, just to see where it might lead. That day, the weather was perfect, bright sky, mild warmth, a little breeze moving through the trees. I felt light and restless, like I needed to push further than usual. The woods around me were thick, moss hanging from the branches, ferns crowding the ground. It was the kind of forest where you could step 30 feet off the trail and feel completely hidden from the world. After maybe an hour, I noticed a faint break in the undergrowth leading away from the main path. It wasn't an official trail, but it was clear enough that someone had used it before. Maybe deer, maybe people. I figured I'd follow it just to see. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I had to duck under low branches as I walked. The sounds of the main trail, distant voices, occasional barking dogs, faded quickly until I was surrounded only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird. I was using my phone's GPS to keep my bearings, checking where I was in relation to the trail. The little dot drifted further and further from the line, but I wasn't worried. I had plenty of daylight and I could always retrace my steps if needed. That was the plan, at least. The further I went, the stranger it felt. The woods weren't unusual, but the silence became heavy. I'd stop and listen, and for a moment it seemed like even the birds had quieted. I pushed on anyway, telling myself I was just being jumpy. That's when I stumbled across the road. It wasn't a normal road with cars and signs. It was a narrow, cracked strip of pavement cutting right through the trees. It didn't fit with the rest of the forest. No markings, no sound of traffic. Just asphalt that looked half forgotten, with weeds pushing up through the cracks. I hadn't expected it, and the sight of it stopped me cold. I don't know why, but it felt wrong, like finding something where it didn't belong. I stood there, staring, trying to picture who would have put a road out here, and why it wasn't on the map. On the other side, the ground sloped steeply upward, a hill covered in brambles and roots. Then I thought I heard it, the faint hum of a car in the distance. My chest tightened. Out here, the last thing I wanted was to be caught wandering by someone who thought I didn't belong. I panicked, scrambled up the slope, grabbing roots and rocks for balance, heart racing like I was about to get caught doing something I shouldn't. By the time I reached the top, my arms were scraped and I was out of breath. And that's when I saw them, tents, a whole cluster of them, at least a dozen, maybe more, set up in a rough clearing on the flat ridge above the road. Bright colors, tarps strung between trees, camp chairs folded up in the dirt. It wasn't like a family campsite you'd find at a park. It was messy, improvised, with piles of gear and plastic bags scattered around. The sight of it hit me in the gut. This wasn't just a couple of backpackers resting for the night. This looked like people who had set up long-term, people who didn't want to be found. The worst part was the time of day. It wasn't dusk, it wasn't evening. It was bright afternoon, and yet I saw no one moving between the tents. No voices, no fire, no sound of life. Just the silent presence of a camp that shouldn't have been there, deep in the woods where no official sites existed. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I crouched low without even thinking, as if someone might already be watching me. My mind spun through possibilities, illegal campers, squatters, something worse. I imagined them stepping out of the tents, angry that I'd stumbled across their hideout. Nobody good sets up that far out, I thought. Nobody you'd want to meet. I backed away slowly, trying not to snap a branch or crunch leaves underfoot. My shirt clung to my back with sweat, even though the air was cool. Each step away felt like a mile. Finally, when I was far enough that I couldn't see the tents anymore, I turned and slipped downhill, heading back toward the way I'd come. But something had changed. The woods felt different now. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound closer. I thought I heard the faint crack of a stick behind me, then brushed it off as my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that maybe I hadn't been as quiet as I thought, and someone from that camp had noticed me. The hike back was a blur. I checked my GPS constantly, following the little dot toward the main trail. My legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally stumbled out onto the official path again and saw a family walking toward me, pushing a stroller, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of relief. The normal world was right there, casual and safe. But the image of those tents stuck with me. The silence of that camp. The way it felt wrong, like I had crossed into someone else's territory without meaning to. I never saw anyone, but that didn't make it better. It made it worse, not knowing who they were, why they were there, or if they'd noticed me slipping away. When I finally made it back to my car, I sat for a long time before driving off, staring at the tree line. The woods had always felt like a place of freedom to me, a place where I could disappear and breathe. After that day, they felt different, more like a place where other people could disappear too, for reasons I didn't want to know. And that's what stayed with me most. Not the hike, not the road, not even the tents. It was the thought that some things you come across in the woods aren't meant for you to see. And if you do, the best thing you can do is what I did. Leave as quietly and quickly as possible and never go back. I always thought the scariest part of being out in the woods was the wildlife. I grew up reading about bear attacks, mountain lion stalkings, packs of coyotes testing hikers, even snakes hidden under piles of leaves waiting for a careless step. But what I learned on one hike, a lesson that has stayed carved into my mind since, is that nothing in the woods feels scarier than realizing another human being might want to hurt you. Almost getting kidnapped made staring down a bear feel like nothing in comparison. The hike started off like any other. It was the beginning of fall, one of those crisp mornings when the air feels cool enough to bite at your nose, but the sun is still bright, spilling through the trees in broken golden shafts. The leaves were only just starting to turn, so the forest still carried more green than red or orange, but here and there I could spot hints of color waiting to take over. I had taken this trail before, long, winding, not particularly steep but remote enough that you could walk for hours and not see anyone else if you timed it right. That was one of the things I liked about it. It gave me peace, some kind of separation from everything in town, the noise, the endless distraction of screens and lights and people. That morning I packed light, just a backpack with a water bottle, a protein bar, a small first aid kit, my phone, and a folding knife I carried more out of habit than anything else. I wasn't expecting trouble. I never did. The trailhead was quiet when I parked. No other cars. That always gave me a small thrill. It meant I had the place to myself, and there was something satisfying about knowing the entire stretch of trail ahead belonged to me alone. I locked my car, slung the bag over my shoulder, and started walking. The first few miles passed without a thought. My boots crunched over loose gravel and damp soil. Birds called above me. Squirrels ran across fallen branches. The air smelled sharp with pine and wet leaves. I got into a rhythm, each step steady, breathing calm and even. My mind wandered the way it always does when I'm hiking. Old memories, unfinished thoughts, random songs looping in the background. I must have been walking for a little over an hour when I first noticed something that didn't quite fit. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own or maybe a deer somewhere off in the brush. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The crunch of weight on dirt was behind me, faint but timed almost too well with my own steps. I slowed down and the sound behind me slowed too. I stopped, and after half a heartbeat, the other steps stopped as well. I turned around, scanning the trail. Empty. Just a long strip of dirt between trees, shadows stretching over it like veins. I stared for a while, half expecting someone to step into view, but no one did. Eventually, I told myself I was being paranoid. Sounds carry in the woods. Maybe it had been some animal moving just out of sight. I adjusted the straps on my bag and started walking again. But after only a few minutes, I heard it again. That steady crunch of dirt and leaves, not loud but present. This time, I didn't stop completely. I just shifted my pace, quickening for a bit, then slowing suddenly, like testing to see if the rhythm would match mine. And it did. Almost like whoever was back there wanted me to know but not quite see them. My skin prickled. The sun was still shining through the trees. Everything still looked normal, but the air felt different. I kept glancing back, hoping for a glimpse of someone, but the path stretched behind me empty. I thought about calling out, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to announce my voice to whoever was back there. I walked faster, pushing my stride longer, telling myself I'd just go as far as the ridge and then turn back. The ridge was about a mile ahead, a place where the trail opened up slightly with a view across the valley. I knew there was a side trail near it, one that looped back toward the road, so I decided that's where I'd change my plan. But before I got that far, I noticed something worse. When I stopped suddenly at one point, crouching like I was pretending to tie my bootlace, I caught sight of movement between the trees just off the trail. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, the shape too upright, too deliberate. A figure partly hidden by the trunks. And as soon as I looked in that direction, the figure froze, like it knew I was watching. I forced myself to stand up calmly, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't noticed, but now I knew. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was back there, following me, ducking between trees, keeping just far enough away to avoid being seen clearly. My mind started racing through every possible explanation. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who liked keeping distance. But if that were the case, why not just walk normally on the trail? Why hide? Why stop when I stopped? Why duck into the trees? I decided to test something. When the ridge came into sight ahead, I sped up and then abruptly turned onto the small side trail leading toward the road. It was narrower, covered with more brush, but it gave me a way to cut the hike short. As I made the turn, I glanced behind me. For just a fraction of a second, I saw a man step out onto the trail where I had been moments before. He was wearing dark clothes, maybe black or navy, and his head was bare, hair cropped short. He wasn't carrying a pack. He wasn't walking like a hiker. He was just there, watching me, his body still. The moment I saw him, I turned back and moved faster, practically jogging down the narrow path. My throat felt dry. My hands were clammy. Every sound of snapping twigs behind me made my nerves scream. I didn't look back again. I just kept pushing forward, counting the bends in the trail, remembering from maps how far it was back toward the road. But the path felt longer than I remembered. And then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, closer now. He wasn't bothering to stay hidden anymore. Whoever he was following me openly. I broke into a run. My backpack bounced against my shoulders, straps rubbing at my collarbone, but I didn't slow down. My boots pounded the dirt, lungs burning. I could hear him running too, that same pounding rhythm not far behind. Every instinct in me screamed to keep going. The trail spit me out near a ditch at the edge of the road. I scrambled up, nearly tripping, and stumbled onto the asphalt. For a second, I didn't know what to do. My car was still more than a mile away down the main trailhead. The road stretched empty in both directions. I turned right and ran along the shoulder, praying I wouldn't hear him come crashing out behind me. I kept running until my chest felt like it was tearing apart. Finally, when I glanced back, I didn't see anyone. The woods looked still again. My pulse was so loud it felt like the only sound in the world. I slowed, then walked backward a few paces, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I didn't trust it. I stayed on the road, kept walking fast, checking behind me every few seconds. Eventually, I made it back to the small dirt lot where my car was parked. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys, dropped them twice before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the locks, and sat there, breathing hard, staring at the treeline. I didn't see him again. No movement, no sound. Just silent woods, golden light, and the normal stillness of a fall afternoon. But I knew he was real. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had followed me, close enough to chase me, close enough to try something if I had hesitated too long. The drive back home was a blur. My heart didn't calm until I was pulling into my own driveway. Even then, when I went inside, I kept checking the windows, certain I'd spot a figure on the street outside or lurking at the edge of my yard. That night, I barely slept. The memory of him standing still on the trail, just watching me, replayed every time I closed my eyes. And the thought kept crawling back, colder than anything else. A bear might charge you if you surprise it, but it won't stalk you for miles. It won't plan. It won't wait for you to be vulnerable. People will. Almost getting kidnapped out there in the woods was far worse than any wildlife encounter I could imagine. It made me realize that out there, the scariest thing isn't the animals. It's the people who don't belong, the ones who hide in silence until they decide to make their move. And once you've felt that presence behind you, heard those steps sync with your own, you can never quite hike the same way again.